So we're picking up right where we left off in adolescent development and talking about chapter 8 and family systems. And so we were discussing parents as managers. We talked about the fact that it's important for parents to be an effective manager for adolescents to reach their full potential. And this is so that parents can help those adolescents make contacts, find information, help them structure their choices, and also provide guidance for them. And so we talked about how important this is also to establish this relationship earlier before adolescence starts, because those situations where we have really effective monitoring, adolescents who are willing to disclose to parents about their whereabouts and activities and who their friends are and relationships with them, that's really linked to positive adolescent adjustment. And so we know from research that it's really important that relationship is established even earlier than adolescence so that it can move and mature into that new relationship. So when it comes to parenting styles, and I have another video on here that goes into much more detail about different parenting styles, but this is just something that just touches on the basics. And so, psychologists have been looking for and trying to understand the right parenting ingredients that's going to promote competent social development in adolescence. And we know that there are certain things that need to be in place that work better than others. And of course, we do have to consider the child, we have to consider the parents, we have to consider relationships. But what we find is that there's a lot of work on the different kinds of parenting styles. And there's a particular set of research looking specifically at 4 different types of parenting styles. And so the first one here, this is authoritarian, and so this is more restrictive. It's a punitive style. It's one that's kind of considered to have a lot of rules in place. There's not a lot of wiggle room, and it's like, I'm the parent, I'm your boss, listen to what I say, and you have to do what I say. Authoritative, this is a much more encouraging style. It's where parents encourage students to be, adolescents to be independent. And so it encourages independence, but also what it does is it does place some demands and some controls, but it's not really it's not as restrictive as authoritarian. And so what this is encouraging independence, but also having some limits and having some controls on the actions. Now, a neglectful style, this is a very uninvolved style. So this is where a parent is, just not very, it's not really involved. They're whether that's because they take a hands-off approach, or if they decide to go ahead and just have a freer style where they don't really become involved. And then we have, of course, the indulgent style, and there's different styles within these styles. If you look at that other video, it talks about different versions of these kinds of blends and mixes of styles. And so these aren't, just because there are 4 styles, these aren't the only ones, but, neglectful and indulgent, these are different types of parenting styles. And so indulgent, which would be more of a very, very highly involved parenting style, but there's not a lot of demands in place. So this is highly involved, but not a lot of demand. So there's not a lot of control there. It's a very kind of, think of it like, it's free, just do what you want and do what makes you happy, but also that the parent is actually paying attention to what's going on, but there's no real set guidelines or rules. They're just, it's kind of a free-for-all. And so when we look at research with, for example, ethnic groups, what we find is that there are some aspects of this authoritarian style that does seem to be associated with positive child outcomes. Now, it doesn't mean to say that the style in of itself is better for a certain ethnic group. It just seems to be that there are some qualities of this that are associated with positive child outcomes. For example, having restrictions for education and expectations for doing schoolwork, things like that, can positively impact a student's performance in academics. And of course, elements of the authoritarian style may take on different meanings, have different effects depending on the context, the child, the relationship, the parents, the marital relationship, if the parents are married, et cetera, et cetera. And so the one bad thing about the looking at parenting styles is that it doesn't really capture this sort of theme of reciprocal socialization, which is what we talked about at the beginning of this material. It doesn't really talk about synchrony. This is just really looking at the parents and sort of what technique they're using, but it doesn't really take into effect that parenting is, it can be affected by the behavior of the child, and that can affect how then the parent responds. And this kind of goes back and forth in that reciprocal relationship. And a lot of times parents are using a combination of techniques rather than one single technique. So instead of saying, oh, I am just an authoritarian parent, they may have some indulgent aspects to it, or they may have some flexibility on certain rules for certain things. Again, same thing with authoritative, is that we might see some blending in with certain rules of being a lot stricter than others. And so a lot of critics say that the concept of parenting style is really too broad, and we really need to do a whole lot more research to understand, what is it that we're seeing in terms of these parenting styles and how they work with specific outcomes. So if we look at here, it's just a nice graphic that kind of breaks down the 4 different types. So authoritative here is more accepting and responsive, as well as indulgent being acceptive and responsive, except the difference between these two is that authoritative tends to have more controls and to be more demanding in terms of expectations, and indulgent tends to be more undemanding, less demands and less controlling, but both are involved, accepting, responsive to the child or adolescent. Here, authoritarian, we have as being rejecting, unresponsive, and more likely to have some really strict demands, strict controls. And again, neglectful in the same category of unresponsive and rejecting, except the difference is that there aren't any demands or controls because it's a neglectful style of parenting, and there are no expectations set for the child. Okay, so looking at how mothers and fathers parent and co-parent. So we've talked a little bit about this previously, but I really want to get into some of these really important aspects here. So traditionally, as you guys know, historically, mothers really have been assigned to the main parenting responsibility for raising infants, children, and adolescents. It's the mom's job to care for the children. That's really what we've seen historically. But in recent decades, fathers have really taken a much more active role, a much more active parenting role. And we see that in a lot of cases we have, especially in the past couple of years with changes with the pandemic and people losing their jobs, for example, we see a lot more stay-at-home dads than we do moms compared to previous years. What we find in the research between how mothers parent and how fathers parent, we do see that they interact differently with their kids. And so what we find is that mothers tend to be more involved with their children and adolescents, but fathers tend to increase the time that they spend in parenting when they have a son. So that's a really interesting kind of difference there, that the gender of the child does seem to impact involvement. And in a lot of cultures, what we find is that mothers tend to socialize daughters to be more obedient and more responsible than they do with their sons. And this, again, depends on how traditional the culture is in terms of gender stereotypes and roles, as well as the family itself. So you can be in a culture that is not really, that doesn't have as strict traditional gender roles, but if the family itself follows that, traditional gender roles, then we're going to find that in this case, for example, mothers were going to socialize their daughters differently. And in a recent study of non-Latino white two-parent families, what we found is that for both boys and girls, adolescents tend to spend the most time with the same sex parent. And so girls tend to spend more time with the mothers, and the boys tend to spend more time with the fathers. And there was another really important finding was that private one-on-one time spent with the father was associated with higher levels of adolescent self-worth and social skills as well. Looking at some other interesting findings where we see some differences in ethnicity, culture, and race. There was another study that was done that looked at two-parent African American or Black families with adolescents, and mothers tended to report a warmer relationship with their adolescents. Both parents indicated they had a warmer relationship with younger adolescents compared to older adolescents. So these are two-parent Black families. And so another really interesting thing to consider is the idea of co-parenting. And so if you have, we know that mothers and fathers parent a little differently, but when you have parents who are not co-parenting effectively, okay? So when you have parents who are really not joint parenting, so even if they're married in the same household, if there's poor coordination, if there's active undermining and disparagement, so like you say, oh man, mom's not going to let you do that. She's not a good mom, or she's not, I'm better, or whatever. If you have a lack of cooperation, lack of warmth, and there's not a lot of connection from the parents partnering, right? What you're going to find is that actually is going to set the child and adolescent up for developmental risk, and that's going to potentially cause them to have to engage in risky behaviors. And so when you have really good, successful co-parenting where there's coordination, there's no undermining, they are cooperating, there's a lot of warmth and connection from parenting, from the parenting partners, then what we're finding is that this actually predicts fewer risky behaviors during adolescence. Now, remember, there's a bi-directional influence here, and we talked about this with that reciprocal interaction. And what it is that we see that successful joint parenting or co-parenting produces or predicts fewer riskier behaviors. But we also find is that adolescents who engage in fewer risky behaviors, that predicts higher levels of joint parental involvement. So what we're finding is that good co-parenting means that these adolescents are engaging in less risky behaviors, but also those adolescents who are engaging in less risky behaviors, that's going to predict that good co-parenting and joint involvement. And so it's really interesting that, these sort of situations where you have sort of a good kid, a good egg, making it easier potentially for parents to co-parent cooperatively and to coordinate that better. So some really interesting relationships there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the parent-adolescent conflict. And so, for the most part, and we talked a little bit about this before, the generation gap is a stereotype. We know that generally most adolescents and their parents have pretty similar beliefs about the value of hard work, achievement, career aspirations. They often tend to have similar religious and political beliefs because they're a part of the same family system, and that's where those core moral beliefs really came from, right? And so we know that early adolescence tends to be a time where we see parent-adolescent conflict escalating beyond just kind of parent-child conflict, right? We're seeing that sort of escalate up into a little bit more complex conflict. And we do see this increase in conflict in early adolescence, but it's not this like tumultuous storm and stress period that G. Stanley Hall really argued early on. And so, is there conflict? Of course, but that conflict usually tends to be like the everyday things, right? The everyday things of family life. Oh, did you do your homework? No, I didn't do my homework. And then a fight back and forth. Did you do the dishes? No, I didn't do the dishes, and fight back and forth. And what we're finding is it's not really like a huge, this, big sort of event and huge conflict that's tearing the family apart. It's mostly just the everyday stuff that just builds up. About 20 to 25% of those families, that's where we're seeing this prolonged, intense, repeated, unhealthy conflict. This is the stuff that like G. Stanley Hall really argued, that this was the intense conflict, this, storm and stress period. Really, we're only seeing 20 to 25% of families in this sort of type of situation. So that means that, 75 to 80% of families are pretty healthy in terms of conflict. And of course, in those cases where we're seeing this really prolonged, intense, unhealthy conflict, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it doesn't start in adolescence, that these problems probably originated before the onset of adolescence. These are children, younger children who have been engaged in conflict with their parents before they hit puberty, and it could be that there's other contextual things going on there that's causing these conflicts. And we also know that there's a cultural influence here, and that is that, yes, we do see conflict during this period of adolescence, but because we see differences in intensity of conflict, we know that there must be some cultural influence about how either the conflict is prevented or dealt with, or something that's actually changing this relationship. And so, for example, in the US, we see a much higher rate of conflict when you compare different cultures like Japan and India. Japan especially, we're seeing lower levels of conflict compared to the United States. And so what is it about Japanese parents that means that there's a difference here? And so, that's where the question is, and that's where this is sort of an interesting question to answer. What is it that these cultures are doing differently? So here, let's look at autonomy and attachment. I have quite a bit of information here. I know I just have some on the slide, but I really want to go into depth about this because this is a pretty, complex situation. We have a lot of really big topics talking about family systems. And so we know that, and many parents can agree with this who are parents of teens, the increased independence that, really typifies adolescence is often interpreted as rebellion by parents. They're like, you're just being rebellious. This is what the teenage years are all about. But really, honestly, a lot of times that adolescent push for autonomy is really not about the feelings that they have toward their parents. It's more of just a matter of maturation, and they're trying to get more autonomy and independence so that they can move into adulthood. Now, autonomy is not often a super easy thing to define because it can be defined in so many different ways. It's really complex, and it's a pretty elusive thing. What do we mean by autonomy? What do we mean by having this sense of self, that you are separate from your parents, separate from others, and that you are your own being? Well, usually it is the term of autonomy is connotated with things like self-direction and independence. So that's what we typically think of when we think of autonomy, is this idea of, independence and self-direction. And one aspect of autonomy that's especially important is emotional autonomy. And this is something we don't talk about a lot, but the capacity to relinquish that childlike dependency on your parents is an important step into being independent. So you don't want to be seen as a child anymore, right? An adolescent doesn't want to be seen as a little kid. They want to be able to be seen as their own person. And so one part of that is, you hear a lot of times in adolescents saying, don't treat me like a child, stop treating me like a little kid. But they have to have the emotional maturity to be able to be treated in a more independent and less childlike fashion. We also find that there are some gender differences when it comes to granting autonomy in adolescence, and often we find that boys are usually given more independence than girls, and this is especially true in U.S. families, and especially true in those more traditional gender role orientations. So if you have a family that tends to be following along more with those traditional gender roles, mom is, inside doing household stuff, dad is, sort of the breadwinner, and we see that, girls are tend to be taught to be more reserved, and boys tend to be given more independence. Those kinds of households, we're going to see that happen a lot more frequently. Also, the expectations about appropriate timing of autonomy is going to vary across cultures. It's going to vary across parents, vary across the adolescents themselves. They might think, hey, I want to be more independent now, and the parents might not agree, or the culture may, it could go either way, push a child to be more independent, or kind of hold on to them a little bit longer in terms of expectation of being a child longer. And of course, we find that a lot of emerging adults are going to experience a transition in that development of autonomy when they leave home, for example, go away to college, join the military, things like that. Now, one thing that I do want to talk about that's not really on here is I really want to talk about this idea of adolescent runaways and homelessness. And so I want to just give a few minutes on this because I think this is an important topic. This is a little bit of an older statistic, but about a little over 1.5 million youth run away from home each year in the U.S. And a lot of times what we find is that those adolescents or those youth tend to be very, very unhappy at home. And they tend to run away from families where we see that maybe a parent or another adult might physically harm them or sexually exploit them or abuse them. And we do find that in cases of runaways. It's not every case, but it is a common theme that there's some kind of abuse happening. But we often see, so a lot of people think, oh, so-and-so ran away. That was unexpected, but really oftentimes it isn't, because it's a gradual process. And so adolescents will end up spending less time at home. They tend to spend more time on the streets or with a peer group. And that running away process is actually a lot more gradual than people think. So the person might be reported missing because they ran away, but usually there are a lot of signs that were in place of why they ended up running away, and the fact that they eventually decided to leave. There was a longitudinal study done not too long ago of more than 4,000 youth. And these were adolescents aged between sort of grade 9 to age 21, so moving into that emerging adulthood. And what they wanted to know is why did they run away from home? What was the issue? And so what they found is an association between lack of parental support. They found school disengagement. They found depression and substance use even as early as grade 9. So parental support, really important here. So parental support, school disengagement. So those students were, or those kids were not going to school, or not, actively involved in school. We saw depression as being a part of this, and we saw substance use. So all of these things were factors involved in those youths who ran away from home. And so, typically we don't find that adolescents don't just simply move away from parental influence, right? They don't move away from this into a sort of a decision-making world of their own. This has got to be a gradual process. This is something that has to be a psychologically healthy process. This has to be something that they move into, with their parents' help. And so that's why it's so important to have that parental support in place. Okay, and so one thing that I really want to note here is about attachment. And so if you've taken child development, what you'll find is that attachment is a really important process in infancy, moving through childhood, and even going through adolescence. And as an adolescent becomes more independent and autonomous, it is important that they're that they are attached to their parents. It's psychologically healthy for them to be attached to their parents. And so you guys might have remembered there's some really big names when it comes to attachment. Bowlby and Ainsworth. So Mary Ainsworth, for example, these were really big names in in attachment theory and trying to understand infant attachment to caregivers. There were a series of studies with animals, with monkeys, looking at this. And so, they argue that secure attachment in infancy is central to the development of social competence, not just as a child, but also through adolescence to early adulthood. And so in a case of secure attachment, this is where the infant is going to use a caregiver. And a lot of the studies early on were just looking at mothers, but caregiver can also be a father. Looking at that caregiver to be a secure base from which to explore the environment, right? And so this is a foundation for psychological development that happens later in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So that's a secure attachment. And an insecure attachment, that's where we're going to find that the infant is going to avoid the caregiver, or they're going to show resistance or ambivalence. They just don't care. They don't really, respond to the caregiver. And so, these are kinds of concepts that are going to predict the likelihood of the secure attachment that, for example, an adolescent is going to form with a romantic partner, both during adolescence as well as later on. And so what we find is that, the most consistent outcomes of secure attachment in adolescence are going to involve also positive peer relations, and development of that adolescent's emotion regulation capacities. So again, that adolescent has to be sort of, given the proper environment to have healthy emotional regulation in order to develop really good, healthy relationships. And so looking at some of the older models, for example, of attachment, okay, so looking at the old versus the new model, the older model of the parent-adolescent relationships really suggested that as an adolescent matures, they're going to detach from they're going to detach themselves from their parents, and they're going to move into this world of autonomy apart from their parents. And that the adolescent parent relationship is really, really conflicted, it's intense, and it's stressful. So this is the kind of old model. And this is where we have learned that this storm and stress is really probably not really, that exact, it's pretty exaggerated. And so what this new model is stressing is that parents are serving as an important attachment figure, the important resource and support system, as an adolescent is going to explore this wider, more complex social world. And we find that in the majority of families, this parent-adolescent conflict is pretty moderate rather than severe. And that what we find is that sort of everyday sort of minor disputes and negotiations are happening, daily, and they're pretty normal. Right. And so, these are really, these are really interesting models. This one being kind of, the old way of, oh, it's all conflict, and, they're kind of breaking off into this new world. Whereas the new model saying it's much more gradual, much less conflict. And so looking at how, the newer model is really a gradual system, it really fits in nicely looking at the previous, as a child, this attachment with the parenting, right, with the caregiver or parent, and so this is again moving that child into adolescence and into adulthood, and so. As that adolescent is moving into emerging adulthood and starting to have romantic partners, the relationships with the romantic partners are going to be different from those of their parents. And those romantic partners are going to fill some of the same needs for adults as the parents do for their children, right? And so we find that when those young adults are securely attached in their romantic relationships, they're actually, in a lot of studies, we're actually more likely to describe those early relationships with your parents as being more securely attached. And so we know that there is this link between how an adolescent is currently attached to their romantic partner with how they were attached early on in their own childhood. And of course, that really current attachment style with a romantic partner is going to affect a lot of domains of their life, and it affects things like their own parenting style. Now, just because we see some attachment insecurities being related to relationship problems, attachment style is only a portion of the contribution to relationship functioning. There's a lot of other factors that contribute to relationship satisfaction and success. The reason why I say this is because a lot of times those students will come up to me and say, well, I'm looking through and I'm learning about attachment styles, and I don't feel like I had a secure attachment style to my caregiver as an infant. Maybe they say, I just, I didn't. Maybe you had parents who were neglectful. Maybe for example, whoever your primary caregiver was, you felt like you had an insecure attachment. You felt like that describes you. That doesn't mean you're destined to never be able to have a healthy relationship. It's just one factor, and it doesn't mean that you're going to have a insecure attachment to your to your partner. It just means that there are some things there that you might want to investigate, right? Explore. And having a good counselor will really help you make sure that you're doing the right things to have a healthy relationship. And especially it helps when your partner has had secure attachments even as a very young child in infancy, because they can help model what a healthy relationship is. But again, there's a lot of factors to consider there. So I will do another video moving on to the other topics that we didn't get a chance to cover. And if you have any questions, you can email me.